Good morning or good afternoon, everyone, depending on your time zone. Thank you for joining today's webinar on the Fararano Final Performance Evaluation. My name is Emily Marshall, and I'm the Award Manager on the Impel Associate Award under the IDEAL activity. Before we start the presentation, I'd just like to go over a few practical things for this webinar. First of all, we encourage everyone to introduce themselves in the chat box with your name and organization. We'll be using the chat box for any communication related to technical difficulties, any questions other than technical content on the webinar. You can also reach out to my colleague Sid Senthilkumar on there who can help you with these technical difficulties. In addition to the chat box, you'll see a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. This is where we welcome you to post any questions you have related to today's presentation, and please feel free to post anytime throughout the session. Our presenters will answer your questions during the Q&A session after the presentation. Finally, we will be sharing the PowerPoint slides and recording of this webinar after it ends, as well as the links to the final report. We are joined by John Dunlop, the Mission Director at USAID Madagascar, who will now provide a brief introduction for the project. Over to you, John.
Thank you, Emily, and hi, everybody. Thank you all for joining today for this final performance evaluation for the Fararano project. Fararano started before I arrived as Mission Director in Madagascar, but I've had a couple of years now to watch it in action, and I've always been very impressed by both the Asotri and Fararano projects in terms of their activities and their implementation on the ground, and the range of different things that they have undertaken to accomplish. I'm very interested, I think we're all very interested to see both the evaluation of Asotri and Fararano in terms of understanding what has been achieved. And I think it's important to kind of put into context the reality of the situation, which is that there are environmental factors in southern Madagascar that the noise from those in terms of their impact on society can overwhelm the best of projects. And so I'll be very interested to see what the findings are from today's presentation. I think as I sat in on the Asotri presentation a few days ago, obviously we take very seriously, these were both very large projects, multi-year projects with really significant aspirations in terms of impact on the population. And we take the evaluation of those projects very seriously, but even more so as we move into the Fitovinany and Mahara projects. I hope I've pronounced those two right. That we take really seriously the lessons from these first two projects from these first 5 years and apply them as vigorously as possible to the coming 5 years. And yet we face some serious challenges in doing that. The first of which is obviously that while we had the advantage of doing baseline data collection for Fararano, this is going to be much more challenging in today's environment with COVID and the restrictions on movement and the dangers of interaction with people that come with the coronavirus. However, I think that we really need to take these lessons very seriously and do everything that we can, and I'll be very interested after this presentation in the coming weeks and the coming months to know how and in what way the lessons from the two projects are being applied to the new projects. So I'd like to just kind of underscore again how seriously we take these analyses and how important they are for the people of Madagascar. And I mean, really, this is, with no exaggeration, seriously life-saving stuff that we're endeavoring to undertake here. I'd like to thank Impel and Tango International for the work that they've done in terms of this analysis. I know that it hasn't been easy, but just finish off by saying I'm very much looking forward to hearing today's findings, to compare them to the findings from the previous evaluation from, I want to say, Tuesday. And the days kind of blend together here at this point. But and then so important to have the follow-on discussion in terms of how those lessons, those findings are being incorporated into the next 5 years. So with that, thank you very much. And Emily, I guess I'll turn it back over to you, or maybe Kevin, I'll turn it directly over to you. I'm not sure. Whoever wants to talk next can do that. But I'm very much looking forward to this. Thank you very much for everybody for being here today, and try to think of interesting and difficult questions. So there we go. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. That's in the SO3 webinar was on Tuesday, so you had that right. I'll now hand it over to Jean Downen, who's the Vice President at Tango International. Jean will be our moderator for today's event. Over to you, Jean.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you, Emily. And thanks to John Dunlop for that nice introduction and the invitation to ask really, really hard questions. We're happy today to present the summary of the evaluation findings of the Fararano project. The project was evaluated by a team from Tango International. Tango is a consulting firm based in Tucson, Arizona. And the team was led by Kevin Henry, who is today's presenter, accompanied by Bernard Kren, Dr. Vero, and Jennifer Laux. Backing up the team was Douglas Brown, who is also on the webinar today, who is the quantitative analyst for the data collected during the quantitative survey prior to the qualitative team going out into the field. Without any further ado, let's get started, and I will turn it over to Kevin to start the presentation. Thank you.
Okay, good morning or good afternoon to all of you who are on this webinar. I would like to start by just acknowledging John's comments, because I do feel that our evaluation did produce a lot of lessons learned, and we did generate a lot of recommendations. This presentation will only cover some of the highlights from that, so I really do encourage those of you who are interested and those who are implementing the next project to dig in deeper into the full report. I also, before we get started, would like to again acknowledge my fellow team members, Vero, Jennifer, and Bernard. I'd also like to thank the CRS team, who was very cooperative and in the evaluation process, and I think hopefully they will find that the results of the evaluation are useful to them. I'd also like to thank all of the many participants in the focus groups and key informant interviews. So without all of those inputs, we wouldn't have been able to produce the report. I'll just start by acknowledging what the people on this webinar already know. Madagascar is a challenging context, and this project was designed in 2014. You know, there was, you know, yet another political crisis and, you know, longstanding problems of weak governance, degraded infrastructure and public services. Madagascar also frequently is on the receiving end of natural disasters, both cyclones, as noted on the slide, but also major droughts, particularly in the southern part of the country. So poverty is an endemic problem in Madagascar, 78% of the population living in poverty. And the map shows you the 3 project areas, and we'll come back to that as one of the challenges in implementing this project. But as you can see, the populations in those areas experience a high degree of poverty and food insecurity. Next slide. I'll touch very briefly on main findings because we'll get into this more subsequently. But just to say that there were some very positive outcomes in terms of child health and nutrition, significant increases in per capita expenditures, progress in terms of knowledge of improved agricultural practices, particularly among lead farmers, and also positive gains in terms of community capacity to manage shocks, particularly cyclones. Also, our evaluation did put a lot of effort into looking at gender and youth, and one of the positive gains we noted is increased engagement for both women and men in their communities. However, you know, I think I'd like to say a little bit more about what are characterized here as mixed results. So relatively poor performance in some components of the project, particularly in the WASH activities and in natural resource management. I think also, and we'll touch on this more, while there was some real focus and gains in terms of disaster preparedness and response related to cyclones, a real weak spot in the project was the lack of a clear strategy and aggressive actions to deal with drought, which is a major risk factor in the South. Also, you know, there are a number of broader concerns about sustainability that we can come back to, but just to highlight a few concerns, we had good child nutrition outcomes, but how sustainable are those in the absence of the supplementary rations, which provided both nutritional inputs and an incentive for participation in other activities. Also, many of the households that participated in nutritional activities did not benefit directly from livelihood activities. So, you know, how are they going to have the income, again, to maintain those improvements? The weak NRM and drought components obviously have effects also in terms of sustainability. And as we'll touch on also later, some of the key intervention models themselves, like the lead farmer model, just as an example, are not themselves sustainable. So how will the gains in some of those areas be maintained? So we'll come back to some of that. Next slide, Emily. So in terms of targeting, our overall finding is that the geographic targeting approach was appropriate, but the geographic dispersion of the project, those 3 very distinct operating areas across 4 regions, is very challenging. And there were quite a few quite remote sites included, which of course bring obvious challenges as well. As I've noted already, only something on the order of 40% of direct project participants indicated that they were involved in agriculture and nutrition interventions. So that's an issue in terms of the long-term impact and sustainability. Next slide, please. We did look quite closely beyond the outcome areas at broader issues that had an impact on the results, including issues related to program design and management. And, you know, on the positive side, people constantly cited the importance of the project's integrated approach, the role of CRSs for implementing partners, The benefits of SILK, the Savings and Internal Lending Community model, you know, we'll come back and talk about that, but that not only had a positive impact and outcome too, but really had impacts that cut across the whole project. Also, the team viewed the work at the Fokuntan in terms of that local level governance as important, but obviously there's more work needed to build those, to build that local governance capacity, the structures and process. The constraints, this project was highly ambitious and overly complex in its design. The context varied greatly, you know, really enormously across project zones. And, you know, that includes, you know, very distinct agroclimatic zones, very different socio-cultural contexts, very different disaster risk profiles. So very, very different. And in addition, you had 4 different implementing partners, which also, you know, has an impact on implementation and results. Finally, I would note that there were something on the order of 20 intervention models used in the project. And obviously, with that level of complexity, it's very difficult to integrate and sequence activities at the community level. Next slide. Methods, I'll go through this very quickly. Doug, who is on the call, can tell you anything you want to know about the quantitative population-based survey, but that did include over 1,000 households, and that was conducted a year ago in June of 2019. The qualitative study for which I led the team, we did 80 focus group discussions and 45 key informant interviews. We also did direct observation of 12 infrastructure projects. And on the focus groups, I would note that our approach was in the 10 core sites that we selected, we did a standard set of focus group discussions, focusing, each one focused on one of the key intervention models of the project. So it was quite a structured approach in terms of how we did the qualitative work. Next slide. So we'll go right into the results in terms of purpose 1, which was related to reducing undernutrition among children under 2, so preventing nutrition among children under 2. So as you'll see from this slide, there was in fact improvement in the prevalence for children under 5 of underweight and stunting and wasting from baseline to end line. Next slide. In this regard, Fararano exceeded the end of program targets for underweight and wasting. So you'll see that for underweight, for example, there was a highly significant reduction from 24% to 16.2% for underweight. Did not quite reach the target of 31% for stunting, but came awfully close. And again, that was a highly statistically significant result. Next slide. Another improvement, increase from baseline to end line in the percentage of children under 2 receiving a minimal acceptable diet among direct household participants. And that was statistically significant among boys. So broadly speaking, children under 2 and households are benefiting from greater dietary diversity and quality. And we I think we can reasonably infer that that was a result both of some improved nutrition behaviors and access to nutritious food. However, it's important to note that the project did miss by, a long shot its target of 30% in terms of minimum acceptable diet. So still a long way to go. Next slide, please. So for prevalence of children under 2 receiving a minimal acceptable diet, there was an improvement from baseline to end line among direct participants and in the East, no change in the South, and a significant increase among boys. And I'll just say, this is the first of numerous slides that will highlight fairly significant differences in the outcomes between the 2 regions in the East where the project was implemented and the 2 regions in the Southwest where the project was implemented. And on the whole, performance and results were better in the East than in the South. Of course, we all know, the even greater challenges of operating and implementing a food security program in the South, but still it's important to note these differences. Okay, I'm going to try to pick up the pace a little bit here because we've got a lot of material to get through. So again, yeah, let's just skip over this slide. Emily, go to the next slide. For minimum dietary diversity and underweight among women, there was an improvement in the East, but no significant improvement in the South. And in general, we found actually that while children's nutritional status under the project improved significantly, there was much less improvement or benefit in that regard to women and to mothers. Next slide. So as I just noted, women may benefit less than family members from increased access to diverse and nutritious food. No significant improvements for direct participant women in overall rates of underweight or minimum dietary diversity. Results in the East, again, much better and statistically significant in the East. So obviously more need for more focus on gender dimensions of food security. It also highlights the importance of understanding the heterogeneity of the circumstances within the project's 4 zones. Next slide. Improvement, significant increase in the percentage of births receiving a minimum of 4 antenatal care visits. So fell slightly short of the target, but there was improvement. But some of the main challenges that were there before remain, particularly the distance to clinics and the cost of medicines. Next slide. Quantitative results on sanitation behaviors are mixed, with better results in the East and South. So there was an increase of from 4.9% to 9.9% in households with soap and water at hand washing stations. Again, the results were much better in the East than the South. Next slide. There was a decrease in the practice of open defecation, but project missed its target in this regard. Again, results much better in the East than in the South. And a number of barriers were noted by the evaluation team in terms of using improved latrines. Households have other priorities. There was indication of stigma being attached to male participation in latrine construction. In some case, small plot size was a constraint. Next slide. Also, there was some indication that the results in Purpose 1 were reduced by weak compliance with care group implementation standards at some sites, relatively infrequent supervision and support to lead mothers, and also inadequate access to MCHN services. Next slide. So we'll go right into the household incomes. We can, just in general, Fararano's interventions produce meaningful impacts during the life of the project. Silk groups in particular emerged as a strong point. Also, farmer organizations which were implemented at a smaller scale also contributed to increased household incomes. Next slide. Per capita expenditures as a proxy for income increased significantly during the project. The largest increase was for adult males with no adult female, that household type. But overall, there was a highly statistically significant increase in per capita expenditures. Next slide. There was also an increase in the percentage of farmers who used at least 3 sustainable agricultural practices. These were not huge increases. They were slightly more significant for female farmers, where the increase was from 26.7 to 39.4. The lead farmer model, however, has low potential for sustainability since it's dependent on unpaid volunteers in the absence of a local government extension service. Next slide. The silk model with private service providers, that specific approach to silk was implemented very successfully. It led to a very significant increase in the use of financial services by farmers. That increase, again, was particularly notable in the East, where we went from 12.3 to 29.8%. Next slide. The team found that producer organizations of various types have a high potential to enhance income gains for farmers, but these started slowly and reached only about 20% of participants in Purpose 2 activities, so about 5,000 producers. Some have already well-established market linkages, but many others, particularly those established late in the project, may not. Next slide. As far as infrastructure investments, those related to Purpose 2 were particularly rehabilitating irrigation systems and feeder roads. On the positive side, these injected food resources into the target communities during lean season through Food for Assets approach, and beneficiaries were highly satisfied with the food. But on the negative side, there were concerns and dissatisfaction with the quality of some of the infrastructure assets and the lasting benefit of those investments to the communities remain to be seen. Next slide. Okay, let's just keep plunging ahead here. So for Purpose 3 is about the community capacity to manage shocks. This purpose is different than the others because it does require more collective action and good governance. So that places more constraints on performance. We found that the results were better where there was synergy between national capacity and priorities and community interests, such as cyclones and bushfire management. Next slide. Fararano created and worked with Focutan disaster risk management committees to address cyclone risk, good cooperation with the line ministry, focus on preparedness and response. The gap, as already noted, was there was a failure to address the risks of recurrent drought in the South. Next slide. NRM activities were primarily implemented through Food for Assets and were primarily reforestation projects through NRM committees that were newly created but not very well supported. So it's not too surprising that in general the results were weak in terms of scale and sustainability. We found that these NRM activities were more project driven, and there was a lack of good integration with Purpose 2, particularly the agriculture component. Reforestation activities were a little more successful in the East and largely a failure in the South. Let's move on to the next slide. Our team, one of our team members focused exclusively on issues related to gender and youth. And I would encourage you to look at the full report for more details on this. In general, the biggest change was increased engagement for both women and young people in communities at all levels. Women and youth benefited from expanded roles and strengthened relationships with peers. The constraint, there were limited financial and human resources allocated to this component of the project, so that lowered coverage levels and the quality of gender and youth activities. Next slide, Emily. For gender, we noted that there was no evidence of increased risks of gender-based violence due to project participation, which is good. So we feel that the approach was implemented in a sensitive way, but direct participant female-headed households fared worse overall than others on all of the Food for Peace poverty indicators. For youth, we found that initially, preference was given to older youth in participating in the project, including those above 25 years, which was the formal cutoff for youth. So in the future, we feel that there's very much a need for an intentional strategy to target and engage the youngest youth. Next slide. So I'll touch on some recommendations here. And again, I would note that this is a subset of our recommendations, and I'm sort of jumping over all of many of the lessons learned that underpin these recommendations, but I would encourage you to look at the full report for those, because we think, this evaluation will be useful if in fact those lessons learned are applied. So we had a number of recommendations at the overall level, and in general for future integrated food security programs, we feel that that a more focused approach should be taken in terms of both geographic scope and the number of intervention models. Again, this project was overly complex in the view of the evaluation team. And priority should be given to those intervention models with the highest inherent sustainability and with strong linkages to either the private sector or local government structures. That's elaborated on in more detail in the report. We also feel that there should be greater attempt to maximize the integration by engaging all households targeted for MCHN activities with one or more livelihood activities to enhance their ability to sustain health and nutritional gains. Next slide. We also, for Purpose 1, our recommendations, our priority recommendations are to provide sufficient supervision and coaching for for lead mothers to ensure the success of the care group approach, and particularly to control the time expected of lead mother volunteers by limiting distances traveled and the ratio of mothers per lead mother. At sites where food assistance is used, design and implement measures to avoid dependence and minimize negative impacts, avoid relying on food distributions for attaining awareness raising and SBCC targets. Finally, there's a need for greater engagement of local authorities in the implementation of sanitation activities. Next slide. For purpose 2, we feel that the lead member model in its initial implementation was lacking because there was no outreach mechanism really to promote broader adoption of promoted practices, beyond the demonstration farm. So there were some attempts to address that after the midterm review, but that was an issue. And also just, we also want to be very explicit that more of the farmers who are trained should be involved in structures like producer organizations and cooperatives so that they can realize the benefits of collective purchasing and marketing as early as possible. We also recommend that CRS continue to implement the Silk PSP model, but seek to achieve the highest possible levels of group formation early in the project. And we can go into that in more detail. Take a more rigorous approach also to ensuring the long-term impact and sustainability of any infrastructure assets put in place using the Food for Assets approach. Next slide. For purpose 3, we really feel that the NRM approaches and activities should be implemented and integrated with the agriculture and livelihood component, not with the disaster risk management component. And we feel that drought should be a much more explicit focus and a need for explicit strategies and greater coordination in drought-prone areas like the south of Madagascar. Next slide. I know I'm running out of time, so I'll try to go through this fairly quickly. We did make a number of recommendations also related to gender and youth. One was to consider waiting until silk groups are operational before implementing SBCC on gender equitable decision-making about the use of household revenue. If there's more revenue being generated through silk and related activities, then we feel that can be a more productive conversation. We feel that there's a need to systematically mobilize traditional leaders as advocates for reimagining rigid gender-based roles and identities. Local and traditional leaders, parents, and even project staff should also be targeted to lift social and cultural barriers to youth empowerment. And we need to consider approaches that promote youth-driven problem solving and learning to enable progress from youth mobilization, which is what we observed in Fararano, to true youth engagement. Finally, very specifically, we feel that separate groups should be created for older and younger youth with approaches tailored to members' age and gender-specific priorities and needs. Next. So that's it. So I took a little more time than I was supposed to, but I hope the presentation was fairly clear, and I'll hand it back over to Jean, who's going to moderate the Q&A session.
All right, thank you, Kevin. We have a few questions coming in to the Q&A box, and I invite people to enter some more. We have two questions regarding your comments on the lead farmer approach. In terms of the lead farmers, One question is, in the absence of the government extension and outreach system in Madagascar, if this approach isn't sustainable, is there a more sustainable extension system or a better approach that could be used? And a related question is, you talked about the lack of motivation to continue being a lead farmer. Are there other models or approaches that could be used? Over?
Yeah. These are good questions, and they're questions that we discussed at some length with our CRS colleagues, because obviously the context is challenging, right? In an ideal world, there would be a government extension service that could link and support individual farmers and groups, but really that is not the case. I think there are a number of other approaches out there. Even the lead farmer model, to me, the major flaw in the initial approach of the project was sort of the assumption you identify lead farmers, you provide them some inputs and some technical support, they create some sort of a demonstration plot, and then somehow magically, you know, there will be spread and adoption of those practices. And I think, you know, everything we've learned over past decades about agriculture and agricultural extension suggests that is not sufficient. Now, this was highlighted in the midterm review of the project, and in response to that, CRS implemented a model that they called Group Dynamique, which was to organize a little bit more groups of farmers around each lead farmer. So, you know, that was already kind of a step in the right direction, and if that had been taken earlier, it might have, you know, led to greater spread. I mean, there are other models out there. Some of this was also discussed earlier this week in the ESOTRI you know, webinar. You've got models out there like the Farmer Field School model and many different iterations of that. So, but the key point I really want to make is the importance of some sort of structured mechanism, you know, to take that learning from individual lead farmers who are trained to much larger groups, and then to promote adoption in the community, an intentional and structured approach. Jean, what was the second part of the question? I mean,
there's a question again related to lead farmers in terms of, are there other behavior change approaches that can be incorporated into the design of lead farmer interventions? Yeah.
Well, again, you know, the Farmer Field School model is one example, because it's really, you know, and Doug talked about this earlier this week for those who participated. It's a way for farmers, you know, to learn and experiment, and to learn as a group, and then to apply. So rather than adopting on their entire field, you know, a new practice, a new seed variety, or a new set of agricultural practices, to, you know, set aside a piece of land, experiment a bit, see what the results are, and then for themselves make decisions. Okay, this worked really well for us, this didn't. So a more participatory, you know, approach, and kind of learning by doing kind of approach. I think that's about all I have to say on that topic for now. But there's a huge literature out there for those who are interested in terms of good practices for agricultural extension practices.
Okay, and I know Doug had a comment on that. So Doug, I'll invite you to pop in and say what you had typed in the chat box.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, sorry about that. I was just simply saying that an important takeaway from the Farmer Field School approach and other approaches is that
Alert from calendar.
the capacity of farmers to adopt practices that they can continue on their own without ongoing support. That's the ideal, so that once farmers learn and experiment with practices, they'll feel comfortable in working on their own with them. So to some extent, whether or not there's an ongoing support network is not as irrelevant if we do a good job in the first place. Much as Kevin was saying in terms of encouraging an experimental approach at small scale, which farmers can learn and evaluate on their own without somebody else telling them what's good.
Okay, thank you. Moving on to some other questions in the time that we have. And I do want to draw people's attention to the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. There are some questions that have already been answered that are in the Q&A box under the answered label relating to nutritional status of children and the percent of the population in the PBS sample who were direct project beneficiaries. So you can take a look at that and the responses to those questions. Another question is that, Kevin, you mentioned that the integration approach, the layering and sequencing approach, was a challenge. What are some of the key learnings behind that, that the evaluation team took away that the new DFSA can incorporate?
Yeah, well, I've only heard anecdotally more about the new DFSA, and I do feel that when it wasn't really necessarily as a result, but I think some of the same lessons learned that the evaluation team took, I feel like CRS and Food for Peace colleagues took in the design of the new project. But a couple specific things. One, first of all, there were just too many interventions. And that doesn't mean, I mean, I could make a case for every one of those interventions. So it isn't to say this intervention was bad, but there were just too many. In fact, after the midterm evaluation, the team had to create a poster just to sort of explain to people how all of these different interventions related to one another. So that's a high degree of complexity for the kind of communities in which the project was operating. I think the other point is on integration, and I would like to emphasize this. I feel, you know, a lot of the beneficiary selection and targeting was really, and this is appropriate, of course, in one sense, was focused on, you know, households with children, you know, in that 1,000-day range, and, you know, focus on those households. But then, you know, not all of those households were also able to benefit from activities that would allow them to increase household income or food production, which would then make some of the, you know, nutritional gains that we did see in the project when food rations were being distributed more sustainable. So I do feel that, you know, if we think about the sustainability of this kind of intervention, you know, those households that get those nutritional benefits early, wherever possible, members of those same households should be involved in livelihood and income generating activities. I think there are a number of interesting issues also related to the sequencing of events. And, you know, for instance, in many communities, you know, the rollout of silk groups took quite some time. And some of that is inherent in the PSP model. And, you know, there are a lot of strengths to the PSP model. But the fact is that if we could find a way to get those silk groups going earlier in implementation, it can support all kinds of other project activities as well. And similarly, you know, if more farmers could have been involved or in organized groups, and this is another element of that speaks to the sustainability of the lead farmer model. If you have more producer organizations, more collection point organizations, more cooperatives, those can become, you know, the vehicle that allow farmers to continue to build on the benefits, you know, of the project. I'll stop there.
All right, thank you, Kevin. Continuing on agriculture under purpose 2, you mentioned that NRM should be included under agriculture. And one participant in our webinar observes that there's a common theme in evaluations, that there's a confusion between NRM expertise and interventions under DRR. So could you explain a little bit more why you think NRM should be integrated into agriculture?
Yeah, and this actually also came very strongly out of the ASOTRI evaluation, which made the same, you know, recommendation. But natural resource management is not just tree planting, and tree planting on lots that might be, you know, government land or whatever. And in fact, a lot of the NRM activities of the project were more geared as a vehicle for, you know, food for assets, you know, distribution, and which then, you know, contributed to the poor results. So, you know, we really need to think about natural resource management in a much more holistic way. I mean, it starts kind of at, you know, taking, say, more of a landscape or watershed management, you know, approach. You know, you've got to be looking at land and soil conservation more broadly. And that really should be an integral part of the approach to agriculture in an area, particularly in an area like southern Madagascar, where drought is a major factor. So whether you're talking about approaches like farmer-managed natural regeneration, conservation agriculture, you know, what's called climate smart agriculture. These are all more integrated and holistic approaches that bring agriculture more into that environmental kind of way of thinking, which is critical, you know, for the sustainability of agriculture in a context like Madagascar. And I'm not saying there wasn't any of that, you know, in the project, but my colleagues and I on the evaluation team found that there was actually very little. So, did that answer your question?
Hopefully, yes. I don't see anything in the chat box. And Doug has added that regarding the question that for sustainable and resilient agricultural livelihood, it's essential that NRM, on which agriculture depends, are sustainably managed, and where they're degraded already, then steps need to be taken to reverse that degradation.
Well, that's a more eloquent and elegant way of saying what I was trying to say. So thank you, Doug.
Okay, we have just a few minutes left. There are a few questions on private sector linkages, asking if you could elaborate more on the private sector linkages, particularly what qualifies as a private sector linkage, and how do you ensure the sustainability of those linkages?
Yeah, well, I think, that's a broad question. And of course, how our CRS colleagues and other implementers, define that, may be a little different than how I think about it. But, there are a couple areas. One that I think, just to give, an example of some success stories, you had a number of producer organizations that evolved into cooperatives and then had very successful relationships with private sector buyers. So for instance, in the East, one cooperative that I visited was very successful in not only expanding turmeric production, but establishing a direct relationship with a buyer in Tamatave, which is actually an international, spice company that was exporting that product. And then they're going on from, that linkage and success with turmeric to expand their activities to ginger. So it's a very clear example where, farmers are able to significantly increase their income by having that sort of direct relationship, with the buyer. And I know CRS is pursuing some of that work further under another project called Spices, and I think there's a lot of potential in that. I think in terms of private sector partnerships, another example that I feel had much more mixed results in the project were some of the public-private partnerships related to water supply and sanitation infrastructure. And while we saw some success stories, and there were some successful partnerships, I think on the whole, it was much more problematic in terms of being able to successfully provide a reliable quality service to communities at an affordable price, and to attract a private sector partner to do the activity in such a way that could generate a profit, which is of course, a primary motivating factor for any private sector partner. So we saw some examples in some of the water infrastructure investments where I think the PPP model, I have serious questions as to the longer term viability or sustainability of some of those partnerships. So those are some examples, specific examples of private sector partnerships as they were explored in the project and evaluated by the team.
All right, thank you, Kevin. We have just about a minute or so left. There is a question on what were the primary wash needs, the water and sanitation and hygiene needs that you found, and what was the role of soap and water, and did that use increase, and was it sustainable?
Well, as documented, and even in the slides, there was some slight increase, and I'd have to go back to quote you the numbers in the use of soap and water at hand washing stations. But the reality is that behavior still is very uncommon. It's a small minority of households who are consistently practicing that. And there are all kinds of constraints, of course, but one of the most obvious constraints in the South is, well, it's kind of hard to wash your hands if you don't even have enough water to drink and to perform other essential household functions. And we can't underestimate just how scarce water is as a resource in some of those communities in the Southwest. So that's probably the most obvious, constraint. But then, obviously there are others more of a sociocultural nature.
All right. And I would refer all the attendees to the final evaluation report, which is quite detailed and comprehensive. And there are links to the report, which has been posted on the Development Experience Clearinghouse in the chat box. So you can access it through those links. I think that's all we have time for. Emily, I'm going to hand it back over to you, but thank you everyone for your participation. We really appreciate your interest and all of the questions that were raised, and we hope very much that you have some useful takeaways from this presentation. Emily?
Thank you, Jean, Kevin, and John for your introduction. And thank you all the participants for joining. We will be sending out the recording and the slides, as well as links to the final evaluation report following this webinar. So please be on the lookout for that in the next few days. We also would like to ask if you could please complete our brief 1-minute event evaluation so that we can improve on similar events in the future. We've pasted the link in the chat box, and it's also shown on the slides now. Thank you all, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.